I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, before we get into our topics for this week, of course, we are once again promoting the NatCon DC conference, September 2nd through 4th. We're all going to be there. There's a lot of great people, great speakers in the lineup, so check that out online and definitely be there if you can. So, all right, on that note, we have a great show for you today. As always, we're going to kick it off with Ben, who's going to talk about Trump firing Federal Reserve the Federal Reserve's Lisa Cook, which is something that the leftist media has been all over. So he's going to talk us through that. Second, we're going to talk about what's happening with Abrego Garcia. Will is going to talk us through his new locale, his new sunny locale. I'm going to go ahead and talk about my local mayor's race. Zohran Mamdani is promising to wipe out misdemeanor crimes. He's promising to legalize crime in a sense. And finally, Amber is going to talk about the DNC summer meeting. So with that, I'll kick it to Ben to start us off.
Well, thanks. And the news about Donald Trump seeking to fire Lisa Cook, one of the board members of the Federal Reserve, follows a theme that we've been talking about a lot on this podcast, which is really the executive branch versus these quasi-private, pseudo-independent agencies. In this case, maybe arguably one of the most underrated deep state entities that there is in the Federal Reserve Board. And maybe we should see this as part and parcel of Trump's broader war with Mr. Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and beyond. But I think what's fascinating about this is Lisa Cook is this board member. She was confirmed on a party line vote, 51-47. This was a Joe Biden nominee. And there are allegations that have been raised against her in what's been termed a criminal referral from the head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, alleging that Cook, quote, falsified bank documents and property records to acquire more favorable loan terms, potentially committing mortgage fraud. Interestingly, a pattern here we see in terms of the same allegations against the likes of Adam Schiff and Letitia James as well. Cook responded to those allegations originally, and she said he's making a criminal referral purportedly based on a mortgage application from 4 years ago. Before I joined the Federal Reserve, these are her words, I have no intention of being bullied to step down from my position because of some questions raised in a tweet. Now, that doesn't seem like she was actually denying what transpired. So we'll have to see ultimately what happens there. President Trump, though, in response to these allegations, went ahead and fired her. And he did so for a cause, which is the only way under the Federal Reserve Act that you can remove one of these board members. Trump has been reluctant to try and fire Jay Powell and not sure what the cause would be there potentially, open to debate, obviously. And Cook has fired back, and she said basically Trump, quote, purported to fire me for a cause when no cause exists under the law and he has no authority to do so. I will not resign. I will continue to carry out my duties to help the American economy as I've been doing since 2022. And her lawyer, Abby Lowell, who infamously or famously represented Hunter Biden and many other prominent deep state figures now against Trump, has said that Cook is going to file suit against the administration. So what this comes down to in part, again, is does the president have the power to fire presidential nominees, and on what grounds? Or does the Federal Reserve get to exist in the ether and essentially have really nothing to do but report to Congress once in a while, and presidents get to appoint these board members, and then this entity acts, quote unquote, independently, even though we know that the Fed has seemingly acted very politically before, especially under Powell, arguably trying to juice the economy through lowering interest rates for Joe Biden and then not moving rates down for Donald Trump. The obvious point to be made is that can there even be an independent agency, so-called, or an independent entity when these are all de facto political actors? And then also, should this be, quote unquote, independent? And then there's a broader debate, setting aside whether the president has the power to fire Cook under these grounds of, central banking itself and the Fed as an entity, and that to me is maybe even the most interesting aspect of this. Is this going to be the sort of galvanizing event, Trump's war with the Fed, setting aside the fight between the executive branch and so-called independent agencies? Is this going to lead to an even more anti-Fed galvanizing force in American politics, which is fascinating? And for me personally, I'm opposed to centrally planning the money supply and interest rates, and we could have a really wonky debate about that. But these are all interesting questions, I think salient questions and very important ones, particularly when you have the Fed and the Fed's governor, the chief, the head of the Federal Reserve Board, who is so at loggerheads with the president as well. So, with that, the last point I'd make is that the Supreme Court itself, and maybe this is dicta, we'll have to see, the Supreme Court in the Wilcox case recently regarding presidential power vis-a-vis these quote unquote independent agencies carved out, arguably, in the eyes of some observers, the Fed as a special entity. And there's a line in the court's opinion that the Federal Reserve is a uniquely structured quasi-private entity that follows in the distinct historical tradition of the first and second banks of the United States. So the Supreme Court might have been previewing that it's going to draw a line in the sand here. We'll see going forward. But with that, I put it out to the group, what do you make of the Cook situation specifically and the Fed more broadly, and again, the executive branch versus these so-called independent agencies?
Yeah, I think that's really the piece of this that interests me, not being a follower of the Fed. Although I will point out that apparently this leaves Trump with two vacancies to fill, one of which he's already nominated someone for. So it could tip the balance on things like interest rates or potentially. But the court here will focus on what for cause means. And actually, I think there's kind of a Marbury v. Madison way out for the court here to ignore. They can give Trump his scalp and essentially deem that he can choose to make this for cause, that this qualifies as for cause under the way that Congress wrote the statute that sets out the governing board and how they can be removed or not removed. So they don't have to invalidate the structure of the Fed to give Trump this scalp, which may be a very like time-honored way for the court to escape that question. This case is probably the furthest along the line of a whole series of cases I've mentioned before that are winding their way through the courts about a bunch of these different independent agencies, whether that's the Merit Service Protection Board that governs personnel, right? Whether that's the CFPB. And the Trump administration here is really pushing the limits of what has been this kind of settled opinion that Congress can make these employees of the executive branch, people who are supposed to be directly accountable to the president, essentially basically impossible to fire. That takes years and years to fire them. You have to have very specific cause, et cetera. Trump is asserting his Article I power to control who's actually working in the executive branch, which, as I've argued before, I think is a long overdue constitutional restoration, because the way that our executive branch operates, where we have essentially the administrative state be operating with no direct oversight from the president, where the president can't fire the people working under him until they commit a felony, for example, it's not constitutional government, right? It's ruled by bureaucrats. So I think these cases are going to be really, really important. This particular one, I think, just because of the nature of how, and I think rightly, the court avoids going beyond what they have to do. I think this is just going to be narrowly focused on whether or not this incident with the mortgage qualifies as for cause, the liberal members of the court will surely argue that it's sort of a cover up and it's a protectual reason to fire her, but that sort of thing. Finally, I want to point out that this person, Lisa Cook, was opposed at the time by a bunch of groups, including my own Independent Women's Voice, right? Because she was a blatantly unqualified DEI hire to begin with for this position. So it was actually Biden that politicized the Fed by putting this woman in here. There were all kinds of things written about it at the time. So this is not coming out of nowhere. People already knew at the time that this woman was unqualified and said so contemporaneously when Biden appointed her. And basically it was seen as a move that Biden was trying to politicize the Fed. So this is not, again, this is not Trump the norm breaker. This is Trump recognizing what has already happened, which is, I think, a kind of structure to a lot of these issues that we see over and over with Trump.
Yeah, and I think the details of the alleged mortgage fraud are pretty interesting too. The DOJ hasn't taken up the case yet, but it's been referred to them by Bill Pulte, who is the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And basically, what she's accused of doing, Lisa Cook, that is of purchasing a home in Michigan, listing it as her principal residence, which gives you more favorable terms on a mortgage application, and then just weeks later purchasing another home in Atlanta, which she also claimed was going to be her principal residence. Obviously, you can't live two places at the same time as your principal residence. And then she's also accused of renting out, I believe, the Atlanta property and not disclosing any rental income. And there's screenshots of her listing the property for lease online, and then never disclosing any of that income. So if the DOJ takes this up based on the evidence that Pulte has presented, it would be a pretty open and shut case of mortgage fraud. The idea that, oh, well, she hasn't been charged yet or she hasn't been convicted of a felony yet. If your employee is accused of pretty obvious wrongdoing and there's evidence towards that, I mean, any normal person would be fired.
Yeah, I love this entire story. I mean, what is this? This is the new version of Black Girl Magic? Like suddenly the first Black female like board of governors, of the Federal Reserve is going to get kicked off for mortgage fraud. Kind of embarrassing. Uh, Moreover, I like the fact that she's going to fight it. We're going to make great precedent off of this case. Because there's just no. I'm sorry. Everybody needs to get a handle on the fact that the unitary executive theory is not a theory. It's the way our government functions. It is the Constitution. The executive power is vested in the President of the United States. The Federal Reserve is part of the executive branch. If President Trump cannot fire a Federal Reserve board member, then the Federal Reserve is unconstitutional as structured. So I think Trump is going to prevail here. I like that she's fighting because she's fighting in a situation where it's bad facts. I mean, this isn't even a removal, at will. This is for cause, and it's the kind of demonstrated cause that would get you fired anywhere else. Like somebody put forward facts that, provided probable cause that you committed mortgage fraud. Well, you can't serve as the head of the board of the Federal Reserve while that's pending. Sorry, you got to go. Even if you're ultimately acquitted of a crime, you do have to go.
Yeah, well, that will kick it right back to you, Will, to talk about Abrego Garcia and his new locale where he's hanging out these days.
Well, he's not quite in Uganda yet, but that's where he's on his way. Criminal Abrego Garcia on Friday was released from prison or from pretrial detention in Tennessee, where he's under indictment on human smuggling charges. He returned to Maryland to hang out with his family for the weekend before having to show up on Monday to be detained again by ICE. ICE has mentioned to him or written to him that they intend to deport him to Uganda. Abrego Garcia's lawyers, including my former colleagues at Quinn Emanuel in New York City, which is just, I continue to be embarrassed by the fact my former law firm is spending so much of its time and energy defending an MS-13 gangbanger, especially on his immigration procedures. This is very different from criminal charges where everybody deserves a defense, but not everybody deserves a defense from removal, especially somebody like this who should not be in our country. But anyway, so his lawyers have filed a writ of petition for habeas corpus, and they are arguing two major points. First, they are arguing that because Abrego Garcia has designated Costa Rica as his preferred venue to be deported to, that the Attorney General must deport him there. That's just flat wrong. If you actually read the statute, the statute vests discretion. It says that the Attorney General should start with the question of where the guy chooses to be deported to, but has the discretion to not deport them to that place. And whenever the Attorney General has discretion, that's not something the judicial branch gets to review when it comes to these removal decisions. And then the second argument they're making is that they have no right to detain him because the time to detain him has expired on an order of removal under Supreme Court precedent, a really bad case, which I read this weekend, called Zavitas, which I don't know if too many people are familiar with. So we can talk about that maybe a little later. But it basically says that even if someone is under an active order of removal, has no right to stay in the country, if he has a withholding or if there's some delay in the deportation and there's not reasonably foreseeable deportation in the near future, you're only allowed to detain the guy 6 months before you have to release him on parole into the country. So that's how we have this really bizarre circumstance where you have people who are under an active order of removal, but they have withholding to one specific country, and yet they're still in the United States. And it turns out the statistics on this are actually quite dramatic. You'd think that if somebody is under an order of removal, had their asylum claim denied, and only had a withholding to one specific country, it would be easy to get them somewhere else. No, only 1.6% of people who are under this active order of removal are actually removed if they have a withholding order. So it's really an embarrassing part of our immigration and asylum system. It has turned withholding or removal into de facto asylum, and getting how to fix all these problems is one of the things I'm going to talk about next week at the NatCon conference, where I'm giving a speech on this very issue. I haven't written it yet, but it will be a banger, I'm sure. So anyway, I don't know what you guys think about the return of the Abrego Garcia thing. I think the final irony I will obviously point out is that his lawyers have complained that it's unreasonable to expect him to go to Uganda where he doesn't speak the language. But of course, the official language of Uganda is English, and somehow he's managed to get along in the United States speaking English, despite not speaking English for well over a decade.
I thought that part was really incredible too, Will, and them claiming, well, he could possibly fear for his life if he's deported to Uganda. Like, that has never been a defense for deportation. And in the small cases where it is, you would have had to claim asylum, which is exactly why he's going to Uganda, not El Salvador, because he has that withdrawal removal order. It's just hysterical. But the reactions to it from the media and the Democrats have been even more absurd. There was actually a tweet from the Democratic Progressive Caucus that said, great news that he was released from criminal custody in Tennessee and was heading back to Maryland. They said this Maryland father should never have been deported and detained by ICE in the first place. So falling back into the Maryland father trope and celebrating as great news the release of a guy who is a credibly accused MS-13 gang member, domestic abuser, human trafficker, really just the worst of the worst. Certainly not the person that the Democrats try to talk about when they usually talk about illegal immigration. Usually it's, well, you know, the grandmother who's been here for 30 years, or the guy who picks our strawberries in California. Instead, they've attached those labels to someone who has really just a laundry list of horrible things that they've done while spending time in the United States illegally. And it's just astounding to me that they continue to hitch their wagons to this guy of all people.
Yeah, you forgot one of the charges, which was apparently solicitation of, like, either, I can't remember if it was just pictures or active sexual molestation of a minor. So there's that too, as a guy who's got that on his rap sheet. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really good demonstration of how our immigration system actually is designed not to work, right? That we have all of these different strings that can be attached to any attempt to deport anyone. And this is why the due process debate is a canard, right? I agree that everybody should have due process, even people who are illegal. The process that's due to somebody who's illegally in the country is to establish that he is who the government thinks he is, and that he is in fact illegal in the country. That's the process that's due. Instead, what we have are these enormous number of appeals, hoops, and various different claims that when taken in conjunction, and especially when taken in conjunction with the backlog of cases because of the number of people who are illegally let into the country by Joe Biden, but also by previous administrations for decades. What we have here is now the absurd proposition that the American people can't really vote to deport these people, right? That no matter what their political decisions and who they choose to elect in office, that there are so many disparate claims and so many hoops to jump through and so many different courts that will have to see these kinds of deportation orders that functionally it becomes de facto impossible, even though you can elect someone who wants to do it. That's not, let me steal the left's favorite phrase. That's not how a democracy works. So there needs to be a real review, and it probably has to involve Congress at some point, of our immigration law in total. The administration is doing the best they can. I think they have a very thorny problem, like the way that Will laid it out, right? Just the fact that every time they try to take this action, there is a new objection to them taking this action. So in that case, and in this instance, this particular case, I think is very illustrative, and hopefully it's showing the American people how difficult it can be to deport someone who just really, really obviously should not be here, and every way possible. Amber's correct, right? This is not, the 30-year grandmother, no other criminal record, right? This is somebody that basically the entire country, except for maybe 10 to 15% of the hard left, agrees should not be in the country. And yet it's impossible for an administration that ran on and was elected on the idea of deporting people exactly like this, can't get it done month after month after month after month because of all of these hoops. So I think it's illustrative in that. I hope the American people are paying attention, because this is something that is not going to be able to be fixed only by this administration. They're doing a valiant job of it, but I really do think it requires Congress.
Which bodes poorly, of course, because Congress has shown very little willingness to actually address these issues. And I think the way that I would kind of summarize it is the Abrego Garcia case. The value to the case is that it shows you that it's an asymmetric playing field entirely. It's very easy to cross over our borders and reside here illegally, and it's nearly impossible to throw anyone out, regardless of how odious and disastrous the record is and how much of a threat they pose to the American people. And I would almost say it's not a failure of the system. This would seem to be how the system was designed, or at least this was how the system was exploited and evolved over time, all in the direction of essentially invasion as the policy. And we've also, of course, talked about all the knock-on political ways that just merely having millions of non-citizens, including legal aliens, reside here distorts political power, distorts representation, and effectively disenfranchises millions of Americans, obviously messes with the results of presidential elections, power in the House, et cetera, which makes it really hard to have a House that might actually do anything about this, let alone a Senate. So one, I guess, upside or silver lining to the Abrego Garcia case is that the insanity of the system is on full display for the American people. Another aspect of it is that you see the left again, and really Democrats writ large, continuing to defend a rotten system that is aimed straight at the jugular of our sovereignty and American citizenry. So those are the benefits. And I think the downsides are, how do we deal with this massive, massive problem of, first, there's been a lack of will to actually ensure that we have sovereignty and security here. We have that to an extent now. But how do you take a rotten system and try to ameliorate the consequences of just a deluge, a flood? I mean, we're trying to essentially put a Band-Aid on cancer effectively. So how do you deal with that? Can you work under the system? And if not, to Inez's point and Will's point, what would Congress have to do, and what's required even beyond Congress? I continue to hold that this is a matter of will more than capability. But that said, it is tough sledding to imagine a Congress that would actually put laws on the books, and then that you would actually have folks who would enforce the laws faithfully here. So I look forward to Will's speech at NatCon to tell us what the answer is, or what the answers are.
And with that, I'll take the prerogative to kick it to myself. I'm talking, I guess I'll be reporting on this for months to come, as he's unfortunately starting to build a pretty substantial lead in the New York mayoral race. But Zohran Mamdani has some truly crazy ideas about crime and the enforcement of crime in New York City. So just as DC is now finally turning a corner, it seems, with an 85% decrease in carjackings, which were, in my opinion, probably the worst kind of widespread crime in DC, and a 25% decrease in violent crime overall. So that's only a couple weeks of the feds coming in and enforcing the law in a city that was, before this, I want to put in the numbers because I'm curious if these two cities will essentially choose two completely different paths and then cross over. Before the implementation of the DC Fed crackdown, and before Zohran Mamdani, if he wins the election, New York City was about 10 times safer per capita than Washington, D.C. So Washington, D.C., truly one of the most violent cities in the country. And I did the 10x I get only from the homicide rates. Those tend to be the ones that are the least juked in terms of the stats. It's hard to hide murder. But it's a stand-in for crime generally. So New York City is 10 times safer currently than Washington, D.C. was before this current enforcement from the Trump administration. and looks to be choosing another path. So one of the proposals, this is a proposal the New York Post is reporting on that comes from the Democratic Socialists of America's platform. Zohran is their candidate for mayor. He's not only the winner of the Democratic primary, he is also the way the parties work in New York City. He's also the candidate for the Democratic Socialists of America. He's heavily involved. He spoke at a bunch of their meetings. He was a key member of that. So they're merely reporting on the platform that Zohran was involved in creating. So according to this platform, what they really want to do is legalize crime. That's going to solve the problem, right? So all misdemeanors, essentially, this platform wants to make, non-criminal offenses, right? And wants to completely direct enforcement away from all misdemeanor offenses, which the platform calls instruments of class war and, quote, criminalization of working class survival. This would be things like jumping the turnstile, right? This is the anti-broken windows policing policy. Let all of the minor things slide and quote unquote focus on violent crime. Well, we know that the opposite is what works. It is actually enforcing the small things that creates a sense of law and order. And also, while enforcing the small things, you catch people with open warrants. A lot of the people who are caught jumping turnstiles on the subway have arrest warrants against them. That's largely why the cops bother doing it. It's not the small ticket or the misdemeanor, right? It's because in catching people who violate small rules, oftentimes they find themselves with an opportunity to arrest somebody who has broken the big rules. So anyway, this is a truly insane proposal. It also just doesn't make sense. I want to quote Raphael Mongwal, who I really highly recommend everybody read his book, I think it's called Criminal Injustice or Criminal Injustice Reform or something like that. But he is the crime guy at Manhattan Institute. I highly recommend his work. But so he actually looked at who is in New York City jails for misdemeanors, because allegedly this is criminalizing the working class, right? It's less than 5% of people who are actually in jail over misdemeanors, because you charge people, they get charged. They're not getting sent to prison for misdemeanors unless there's like some other extenuating circumstance, unless they have bigger charges, unless they were out while on, for example, on New York's insane bail laws on a much more serious charge, and then they were caught committing a misdemeanor. Those are the kind of people who are put in jail for misdemeanors. The overwhelming majority of the city's population in the jails is not there for misdemeanors, over 95%. So this is not something that's going to let a lot of people, out of prison who are in prison for something very, very minor. That's always the line with this stuff, and it's just not true. What it is really going to hamstring the police in enforcing both the small and the big important laws. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to live through this experiment. It seems that people need a reminder every 10 years, every 20 years about the fact that, it's not fun to live in a city where basically law-abiding citizens have to be afraid all the time because crime is so rampant. This is something that Zohran can do on day one. It jibes with other comments that he's made where he wants the police. He's backtracked on straight up defunding the police, but what he said is he wants the police to focus on quote unquote serious crimes, which is his new way of not backing off of this DSA proposal, right? He's also put forward things like, he wants to legalize prostitution. So it's all of a piece of making these quote unquote small crimes go away, which by the way has the effect of making the stats in New York City probably look quote unquote better. When you legalize a bunch of crimes, those crimes get off the crime stats and voila, you have solved the problem. But yeah, curious what everybody thinks about potentially the two trajectories of these two cities, one with a much more serious crime problem today, and one which I fear, I hope not, but I fear will have a much more serious crime problem tomorrow if it chooses to elect Zohran Mamdani.
Your point about people generally not being in prison for misdemeanors is well taken. I often get frustrated at the criminal justice reform people, and I don't even know what the group thinks about this particular issue, but the criminal justice reform people who talk about people who are spending like 10, 15 years in prison for a minor marijuana possession charge. If you look at the people who actually have those extended sentences for various drug crimes, it's usually because they have a long rap sheet. This was not their first offense. Typically, they're involved in distribution or in some kind of drug ring where they were actually far outside of just I have this on me because I'm using it. And the stats are pretty compelling. I think it's something like 90 something, 90+% of people who are serving time for possession have some other extenuating circumstance, which explains why they're in prison for longer periods of time. But just to put a fine point on the DC crime comparison, I have some of the numbers in front of me. And even just going beyond comparing from the 2 week comparison prior to when Trump took control of DC and the 2 week comparison after, but I also have the 1 and 2 year comparisons. And so if you compare the same 2 week period from 2023 to the 2 week period in 2025 when Trump took control of DC, carjackings fell 98%, robberies down 83%, homicides down 80%. In fact, last night was the first reported homicide in almost 2 weeks, in 13 days since Trump took control in Southeast DC. We also see all violent crime down 71%, sex abuse down 56%, and the numbers just keep going. I mean, it's a really significant difference. And for people who have been living through what's been going on in DC and hearing the liberals claim, well, crime was already going down, like, okay, compared to 2020 or 2021 when it skyrocketed, yeah, it's down a little bit, but it's still certainly not where it was 10 years ago, and certainly not to a place where the average resident feels safe doing things that they used to do prior to the pandemic. So I share your concern, Inez, about what would happen to New York if those smaller crimes suddenly become something that the police aren't going to enforce. I'm a huge proponent of broken windows theory because it works. I mean, every study that shows when police start grabbing turnstile jumpers, get people who are doing graffiti on public buildings, it just sends a message to people that crime is not going to be tolerated. And usually the people who are able to get away with those smaller crimes, in addition to what Inez pointed out, which is that a lot of them are people who have already committed other more serious crimes. But the ones who haven't will go on to commit more serious crimes because they've learned perverse incentives, which is that they can get away with this and things continue to escalate.
Yeah, it really is remarkable that, you have New York wanting to go this direction, but perhaps not. You have the loss of so many moderate Democrat voters to the Republicans in the world of Trump. You have people who don't like this leaving New York City to go to Florida or places that are more civilized. And so I think this is, I think you're right to point out that it's apparently every 20 years we need to have an experiment in socialism, as George Will says. But unlike George Will, I definitely don't think it's a good thing. I don't think we should want that. I hope that the Trump administration and Republicans will just absolutely put the screws on Mamdani and anybody else in New York who tries this stuff. We don't have to tolerate our nation's largest city becoming a crime-infested nonsense. I mean, we've already demonstrated in DC what's possible in terms of making a city safe within weeks. And I don't think we have to put up with Mamdani. We should be, bringing down the full weight of the federal government on Mamdani to ensure that he actually keeps New Yorkers safe, because that's the obligation of the federal government to it. Where state and local governments refuse to step in, even foolishly, because of their elected officials, it's still a responsibility of the federal government to ensure that law and order is maintained.
Broken windows policing works, removing violent criminals from the streets, keeps the streets safer. The legalizing criminality, the decarceration agenda, etc. It's a recipe for societal disaster. It's so obvious that a child can understand it, but the left is so indoctrinated and so wedded to an asinine, idealistic worldview. I guess you can call it an idealistic worldview. Maybe it's a nihilistic worldview, a utopic one, that they're willing to put their own constituents through hell. And that's what the voters in New York, unfortunately, are poised to get. I agree. It is the job of the federal government and any and all authorities who can to use whatever levers of power they can to defend the citizens against elected officials who are going to savage the citizenry, essentially. It's a disaster that New York is going to vote for likely a calamity. It's also a disaster on the political side that the non-Mamdani candidates won't get their act together and all get out of the race but one, get behind one candidate and stop this disastrous train from coming down the tracks. But I don't see it happening at this point. And we've got to pray for the safety of sane New Yorkers who didn't vote for this.
And with that, we're going to finish up our 4 topics by going to Amber to talk about the DNC.
Thanks. Yeah, the DNC is having its annual summer meeting right now. It kicked off yesterday morning or Monday morning, and it's been incredible. Republicans are certainly rejoicing at what they've been seeing. The Democrats have learned literally nothing since November. They are continuing to double down on insane wokeness and being obsessed with Donald Trump and offering little by way of any substantive changes to their policy or even their messaging, despite claims from party leadership, from outside liberal activist groups that they were going to try to fix the messaging to better appeal to young people and to men. That has obviously not happened. So they actually opened the summer meeting once again with a land acknowledgement from an indigenous person, complaining about how they are using stolen land to hold this meeting in the first place. The invocation was given by a progressive female pastor, with what looked like a pride scarf around her neck, and someone who has pronouns on her church biography page. And then they just did a parody of themselves for basically the entire day, where they had a group called the Vera Institute, which is a pro-defund the police organization, come up and give a presentation about how cracking down on crime is supposedly authoritarian and that the average American doesn't care about migrants committing crime against Americans or doesn't care about carjackings. They had Keith Ellison, who's the Attorney General of Minnesota, bragging about fighting the Trump administration from trying to stop children from getting sex changes. They had Barbara Lee, the Oakland mayor, come up and talk about how her city is not complying with immigration and customs enforcement. Governor Tim Walz was there because the meeting is being held in Minnesota, and he did his sort of tough alpha guy cosplay where he just comes across as really creepy and waves his hands around to the point where he was like knocking over the teleprompters, talking about Trump's quote, fat ankles and calling him petty, talking about how great the country would have been if Kamala had won the election. We had Amy Klobuchar conflating illegal and legal immigrants, saying that immigrants don't diminish America, they are America. And finally, the DNC chairman, Ken Martin, who allowed himself to get bullied effectively by David Hogg, who's like the least imposing figure possibly in the Democratic Party, calling the Trump administration a fascist regime. And all of this is set to the backdrop, by the way, of this left-wing activist group, Third Way, intoning the Democrats to stop using woke language like white privilege and toxic masculinity and a lot of these other buzzwords that they've become quite accustomed to. And clearly that message is falling on deaf ears. I am quite excited to see what the second, third day of this annual meeting brings about. If it's anything like the first day, I think Vice President J.D. Vance must be licking his chops for 2028 right now. The Democrats have had dismal fundraising numbers, like $15 million cash on hand compared to $80 million for the Republican National Committee. They've been losing in the voter registration fight, where the GOP is outpacing them in 30 states, including some swing states. And they've decided that they're going all in on a gerrymandering war, which would substantially benefit Republicans more than Democrats. If everybody just started going all out on gerrymandering, the Democrats have already done that, right? Like they could get, okay, 5 seats in California and 1 additional seat in Maryland, maybe 1 in Illinois, but Republicans can get, well, they just did 5 in Texas, 5 in Florida. Ohio is doing mid-decade redistricting like they always do, thanks to their state constitution. So Gavin Newsom has basically just given a green light to Republicans to pick up somewhere between 20 and 25 congressional seats if they really want to play this game. So I just think that they're in total shambles, and maybe I'm being too overly optimistic. I'm actually curious what the group thinks. I know we're all kind of pessimists and a bit cynical at heart. So maybe I'm just too excited by what I'm seeing at this summer meeting. But I'll kick it over to the group to chime in with what you think this means for really the future of the Democrats, and am I right to be so thrilled to watch them just doubling down on the same mistakes?
Yeah, I guess I have a few cautionary notes in the Jubilee. I do agree that Democrats have no idea how to proceed right now, in large part because this is the first time that they're not just losing an election, they're actually having their institutional power significantly curtailed. The power of their media is significantly curtailed, the power of their NGOs. Their budgets have been slashed since so many of them are dependent on grants from the federal government, right? The universities are on the ropes with Trump's policy. So this is a full court press against leftist institutions, not just against a particular Democrat who lost an election. And that has changed the game. So overall, I am very optimistic. That being said, politics is not permanent. The Democrats will find their way back in the wilderness eventually. But right now, they're caught between two opposing winds and they're being torn in half, which is one, that their platform of their progressive base is simply wildly out of touch with where American voters are, and American voters are registering their dislike for that platform, right? We call it wokeism, but it's on a whole list of particularly cultural issues, but also economic issues, right? And how they dealt with this last time in the 1960s is it, 60s waned into the 70s with everybody tired of drugs and crime and cultural leftism. We got the 80s. And Bill Clinton brought the Democratic Party back after, a wildly popular Reagan presidency by essentially moderating the party and giving in on a few key issues and being a good politician. That would be sort of the natural way forward for the Democratic Party, but they cannot get around their progressive base. Those are the people who are voting for Zohran, right, in New York City. And those people are super energized. They believe that they're living in a fascist dictatorship, right? So they really can't get around that sort of two-part trap that they've made for themselves. They have to moderate on, especially on some of the cultural stuff, in order to get nationally competitive again. But they can't moderate on that stuff because it's a betrayal of the people who actually vote for them. And a large part of the Democratic Party's dropping numbers are people on the left saying, well, you're not representing me, in the same way that people on the right were saying for decades, we're send Republicans to Washington and they're not actually voting on our behalf in any substantive way. The progressive left just refuses to be represented by people who don't share their agenda or want to do it more slowly or whatever. So I don't know how they're going to get out of that trap, but my note of caution would be don't underestimate the power of lying. And I do think that Gavin Newsom is it will be a formidable opponent in a certain way. The way he's going to get around it is he's going to say one thing to the progressive left and he's going to say another thing to America. And he's just going to keep baldly doing that over and over and over again. You would think that wouldn't work in the age of 24/7 media and everything being on camera, but it does. We're so balkanized. We only listen to our own media sources and so on. It may very well work. I mean, that's the cynical take, is the way to get out of that trap is simply just lie about it. And Newsom is really good at doing that.
It's also worth noting, look at the disparity in terms of what the agendas look like and the successes of the agendas, Democrats versus Republicans. And we're still so tight in terms of the electoral map nationwide. The House is so closely divided. Let's see if Republicans are actually going to pick up a substantial majority in the House, grow a majority in the Senate. Never underestimate, of course, on the other hand, just as we shouldn't underestimate the Democrats' abilities to lie and act cynically and shrewdly. For Republicans to engage in infighting, and that's conservatives versus rhinos. That's the Republicans who hate the MAGA wing of the party, despite the fact that it's provided all of these massive benefits politically and substantively as well. There's still plenty of people who do not want to lean into the MAGA agenda among elected officials anyway. And the other aspect would be, let's see if going into these midterms, are Republicans going to run an aggressive messaging agenda and then actually substantively try and show, here's all the things that we're doing the American people support and here's why they're exceptional? Or are they going to essentially play prevent defense? Typically in the past, they haven't been aggressive in midterm scenarios like this. So One thing is what are the Democrats doing? Another thing is where are the Republicans? And the last point I'd make overall is I agree. The challenge for the Democrats is that the demographics of the electorate don't work right now for either threading some kind of needle or going full progressive. It just doesn't represent enough of the country to win nationally. It does, obviously, in blue jurisdictions. They have to wait a few cycles, and essentially they have to wait for older normie Democrats to perish, essentially, before they have a serious progressive majority among Democrats and can start to try and whittle away, I guess, at the independents as well. But they are right now not only rudderless, but they're also caught because their party hasn't shifted yet to where the ideology is of the animated part of the party, which is with the progressives.
Yeah, I think the Democrats are in really, really big trouble. I mean, you highlighted the land acknowledgement, the fact that you can't realize that that's an obviously 80-20 thing, that most Americans don't consider their territory stolen, that it doesn't even make sense internally because it's, the idea that the property rights of this acknowledgement were frozen in time the moment these people met the Europeans. These people, I mean, American Indians had been fighting each other for generations prior to the arrival of the Americans themselves. So, that you can't get past that you're still doing that at your DNC meetings means that you're totally caught in this insular, lefty academic trap that does not appeal to 2/3, 3/4 of the country. And I think we're actually going to have one of the best midterms that anybody's had in a long time coming up. I'm very optimistic about that. I think we're going to hold on to the House and hold on to the Senate and maybe do even better.
So now it's time for final thoughts. And Ben, can you kick us off?
Sure. So I just want to give a little judicial insurrection update here. There was a recent ruling from the Supreme Court in this case challenging the NIH's termination of grants to DEI, race-based grants associated with COVID-19 that the administration had sought to terminate. And of course, the lower courts blocked this. The Supreme Court stepped in, and as I understand their decision in terms of granting a stay, they prevented the lower courts from vacating these terminations of the grants. So that is, they said, actually, the administration, the NIH can terminate these grants, and that when it comes to matters of, should you be getting this money from the federal government that was purportedly earmarked to you or not, this should go to the federal court of claims. This shouldn't be in a normal district court. On the other hand, I think they said that what the lower courts did with respect to vacating the policy around it, so on the regulatory side under the APA, they said there can be vacatur here of the guidance, but set aside the nuances of that case. What the Supreme Court spoke on in part, and this was through the writings of Justice Gorsuch, I don't think this was the majority opinion, but this was one of the concurrences in part. Justice Gorsuch noted that these lower courts are simply not listening when the Supreme Court puts forth precedent which says you can or cannot rule accordingly in a certain case. And Justice Gorsuch noted that there have been several times now in recent weeks where you've had the government essentially appealing to the Supreme Court to say the lower courts aren't listening to your precedents around these cases, where Supreme Court precedent squarely controls in all these cases. And we'll look back on, I think, ultimately the CASA birthright citizenship case as establishing in part, and this is Jack Goldsmith, this was his theory in part on what the Supreme Court did. They said, universal injunctions are not kosher. However, there are all manner of other ways that you can go about trying to challenge administration's policies. And also, the Trump administration, via the Solicitor General, basically said, we are going to listen to any Supreme Court opinion, judgment, ruling, et cetera, and that precedent controls. So the Supreme Court is supreme over all the other courts. And that was part of the trade that was made potentially ultimately in that case. That's a theory. The Supreme Court now has made clear in several instances that Supreme Court precedent controls over all these lower courts. Otherwise, you have anarchy, essentially, within judiciary. So Gorsuch himself in this concurrence says of these 3 different times in recent weeks where you've had lower courts flouting Supreme Court precedent or de facto precedent, he says, all these interventions should have been unnecessary, but together they underscore a basic tenet of our judicial system. Whatever their own views, judges are duty-bound to respect, quote, and this is quoting an opinion, the hierarchy of the federal court system created by the Constitution and Congress. The fact that you need a Supreme Court justice to put that in a concurrence is very telling, but this also shows that the lower courts continue to defy the Supreme Court. And so what transpired when it came to universal injunctions is only part and parcel of this much bigger fight of the radicalism of the lower courts, who are not only usurping the power of the president, but they're also challenging the power of the Supreme Court over the lower courts as well. So this is a huge fight that continues to persist, and it's going to persist until the Supreme Court puts the hammer down in a substantial way going forward, or Congress does something about the lower court insurrectionism.
My final thoughts are another dose of optimism. I'm the optimist today. The polls in the Virginia governor race have tightened pretty significantly. Winsome Sears, the lieutenant governor, the Republican, has been down by about 17 to 20 points in the race. A new poll that came out this past week has her within 5 points, which is, in Virginia at least, based on what we saw in 2021, really within the margin of error. And a lot of this is happening with the backdrop of the Democrats making similar mistakes that they did in that 2021 race, with Abigail Spanberger mostly remaining silent on a bevy of parental choice issues in schools, where 5 Virginia school districts have been accused of flouting Title IX, ignoring Trump's executive order on preventing people from using facilities that don't align with their biological sex. And there's also been a case where a school district has suspended boys for complaining about a girl who identifies as a boy using their locker room and apparently filming them to get their reactions. Winsome Sears has now been hitting up the school board meetings, really taking a page out of Youngkin's playbook, and it seems to be working. She's raising tons of money. Again, the polls are tightening. I still think it's probably an uphill battle. She doesn't have sort of the same panache that I think Youngkin did in 2021, and it really hasn't been covered as much nationally as it was during the last election. But this is a good sign for her, and I think even just getting close will be something of a victory for Republicans in Virginia. And if she's able to eat into Spanberger's lead in Nova, where it's really heavily blue, over this school choice issue, over the parental rights issue, gender ideology in schools, then she stands a pretty decent chance.
Yeah, another thing in Virginia that would help is if Donald Trump fires a lot more federal workers and they leave Virginia, because that's the reason Virginia is as blue as it is. It's because of DC essentially encroaching into Virginia, which is a traditionally red state, but went lightning fast into like +10 D state. It barely spent any time in that purple range, but hopefully they can pull it out there. My final thought is a New York Times column by David Brooks. So one of the ostensible right-leaning voices at the Times, although really I think the only one that deserves that name is Ross Douthat. So he wrote a column called "The Rise of Right-Wing Nihilism," and I think it's kind of an embarrassing attempt to explain the changes on the right. He highlights a debate between Christopher Rufo and Curtis Yarvin in IM 1776. By the way, a debate where Yarvin has since conceded to Rufo, but essentially the argument that Yarvin is making in this debate was that Rufoism, which means basically institutional warfare on the right, using political power to accomplish conservative goals, especially with regards to leftist institutions, essentially the playbook for the Trump administration in term 2, that was going to be too small potatoes. We need a real complete upending. We need either a right-wing Caesar or an FDR type figure. That's Yarvin's debate. He's a monarchist. But bizarrely, David Brooks describes this as nihilism, and from which I can only conclude that David Brooks has this conception where if you don't buy into the underlying premises of liberalism, the only alternative is that you believe in nothing. I think this is sort of embarrassingly anti-intellectual. Like, people who are always talking about empathy and theory of mind, right, on the left can't understand that somebody is just merely rejecting the underlying premises. Doesn't mean that they don't believe in anything. It means that they don't share your premises. So I think this is kind of an embarrassing article. It also has that annoying sensibility of a lot of these pieces where it's like, okay, we'll give you a crumb from the master's table. We'll acknowledge that people feel put upon by, essentially leftist tyranny. So yeah, I don't know. These pieces from the New York Times, the assumptions, it's really clear that the assumptions underlying New York Times liberalism and the part of the quote unquote right that sort of goes along with that, with those underlying premises, they haven't quite accepted. They're still in the denial phase. They still think that they are, as Bain said, in charge, right? Do you think you're in charge? They haven't really, I think, internalized the fact that they are losing not just political power, but institutional power. And that they actually have to engage with right-wing arguments and with right-wing people. They can't just treat us like zoo animals on the side of the road that maybe will give you a crumb because we don't want you to get too upset, right? We'll acknowledge that it's been difficult for you emotionally to deal with the left or whatever it is. So yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of an embarrassing attempt to explain the new right from the New York Times, but I wouldn't really expect anything better. The only interesting article on the right it's been published in the New York Times in my memory in the last few years is Nate Hochman's article about the rise of the secular right. And they quickly canceled Nate Hochman after that. So
yes, they did. Nate Hochman, my old colleague on the DeSantis campaign. My final thought, what was my final thought? I forgot. I've spaced out. I'm sorry, I lost it. I don't really need a final thought. We'll move on. You guys, I'll come back next week with a final thought.
You have a newborn in the house.
I have a newborn. There's the kids are home. My final thought is somebody drove. Here's my final thought. Somebody drove into the water main at the daycare on Monday and did a hit and run, and as a result, daycare has been closed Monday and Tuesday. As a result, we now have a toddler and a newborn in the house during the day. My wife is doing yeoman's work caring for both of them. But as a result, my broader final thoughts are a little bit bereft, if you will.
Well, when we find out that the hit and run perpetrator wasn't illegal, then we'll have plenty to talk about.
All right.
On that note, on behalf of Will, Amber, and Ben, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman. We'll see you at the next NatCon Squad and hopefully in DC, September 2nd through 4th.